The wind cutting through Washington, D.C. that Tuesday night was not wet or heavy. It was a dry, invisible blade. It stripped the last dead leaves from the cherry trees along the tidal basin and rattled the flags atop the government buildings, a sound like 1,000 hands clapping in an empty room. It was a cold that didn't seep into the bones. It snapped against the skin, sharp and waking. High above the political gridlock, on the 42nd floor of the Hawthorne consultancy, the air was perfectly still. The office was a masterpiece of intimidation, steel, glass, and the terrifying silence of absolute power. Emily sat at a desk that was pushed into the shadows of the main library. At 28, Emily was the firm's secret weapon, though her name never appeared on the letterhead. She was a ghostwriter. She was the architect of apologies for senators caught in scandals, the composer of resignation speeches for CEOs who had lost their way. She possessed a terrifying gift. She could look at a monster and write the words that made him sound human. But tonight, the words were not coming. She rubbed her temples, her fingers stained with the ink of a fountain pen she preferred over a keyboard. She wore a simple charcoal sweater that swallowed her small frame, a deliberate choice to blend into the gray aesthetic of the office. She was tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying the emotional baggage of men who refused to carry it themselves. She was the filter through which their sins became palatable. We build empires on words, forgetting that silence is the only thing that cannot be edited. The digital clock on the wall flickered to 2:15 a.m. Suddenly, the heavy silence was punctured by the sharp, persistent vibration of a phone on a glass surface. It wasn't Emily's. Micah Hawthorne entered the suite, his eyes fixed on the device in his hand. He didn't walk, he advanced. At 35, Micah was the most sought-after crisis manager on the East Coast. He was a man of geometry and logic, built of sharp angles and sharper intellect. He wore a navy suit that was tailored to perfection, not a single crease betraying the 18-hour day he had just survived. He glanced at the screen of his phone, Eleanor Hawthorne, 4 missed calls. The name of his mother, the true architect of the Hawthorne empire, seemed to radiate a cold light against his palm. He didn't answer. He never answered after midnight, but the muscle in his jaw tightened, a silent tribute to the woman who demanded perfection even in his dreams. He tucked the phone away, his blue eyes scanning the room for imperfections. He spotted a chair out of alignment in the conference area and fixed it as he walked past, a reflex of his obsession with order. He stopped when he saw the light in the library. "You are still here," Micah said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and devoid of surprise. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of a variable he hadn't accounted for. "The senator's statement," Emily replied, her voice soft, contrasting with the hard surfaces of the room. She didn't stand up. She knew Micah hated performative deference. "The draft was hollow. I'm trying to find the pulse." Micah walked into the library. He brought the scent of the winter wind and expensive espresso with him. He stopped at the edge of her desk, looking down at the scattered pages. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her work. "Hollow is safe," Micah stated, his mind momentarily flicking back to the cold instructions his mother had given him that morning. "Hollow gets us through the news cycle. My mother expects a denial, Emily, not a confession. And in this firm, Eleanor's expectations are the law." "A denial won't work this time," she countered, sliding a piece of paper toward him. "The public knows he lied. If he denies it again, he looks arrogant. If he admits he was afraid, he looks human." Micah picked up the page. He read it. His eyes moved back and forth, scanning the prose she had bled onto the paper. He stiffened. The words were not just strategic, they were devastating. She had written a speech that stripped the senator naked, exposing a vulnerability that felt uncomfortable, raw, and undeniably real. It was brilliant, and Micah hated it. He hated it because when he read her words, he didn't hear the senator. He heard himself. He looked at Emily then. He saw the messy bun of dark hair, the fatigue bruising her eyes, the way she chewed her lip when she was nervous. He saw the chaos of her humanity, and it threatened the sterile order of his world, the order Eleanor had spent 30 years beating into him. She was the only person in his life he couldn't predict, the only employee whose mind he couldn't map on a spreadsheet. "This is too much," Micah said, dropping the paper back onto the desk. "It's emotional. Emotion is a leak in the hull. It sinks the ship. My mother would fire you on the spot for even suggesting this." "Emotion is the water the ship floats on, Micah," Emily whispered, daring to use his first name in the dead of night. "Without it, you're just grinding against the rocks." Micah stepped closer. He invaded her personal space, using his height, his presence, the sheer force of his control to intimidate her back into submission. "I pay you to think, Emily, not to feel. Your feelings are a liability." He wanted to fire her. He wanted to tell her to pack her box and leave, to remove this variable from his equation, to protect her from the cold gaze of the woman who had been calling him all night. He had tried to fire her 3 times in the last year, always finding a reason to rescind the order at the last minute. He told himself it was because she was useful. He refused to admit it was because the office felt like a tomb when she wasn't there. "You want me to rewrite it?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the proximity. She could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. She could see the pulse beating in his jaw. "No," Micah said, his voice rough. "It's perfect, and I hate it." He turned his back on her, walking to the window to stare out at the Washington Monument glowing in the distance, a stone obelisk that felt nothing, needed nothing. "Go home," he commanded, speaking to the glass. "Submit the file and leave. I don't want to see you here when I come in tomorrow." "Micah!" "Go," he snapped, the crack in his armor showing for a fraction of a second. Emily stood up. She gathered her pens. She gathered her coat. She walked to the door, her heart aching for the man who thought he could control the tide by building a wall. She paused at the threshold. "You can fire the feelings, Micah," she said softly to his rigid back. "But that doesn't mean they stop existing. It just means you stop understanding them." She walked out. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Micah alone in his perfect, silent tower. He looked at the paper on the desk, the speech about fear and regret, and touched the ink where her hand had rested, realizing with a surge of panic that every time he sent her away, the silence she left behind got a little bit louder. And in that silence, the ghost of his mother's expectations felt heavier than ever before. 3 weeks later, the senator's speech, the one Emily had bled onto the page, was hailed as a triumph of authenticity. The polls rebounded. The crisis was averted. And in the sterilized corridors of the Hawthorne consultancy, business returned to its rhythmic, lethal efficiency. But the silence between Micah and Emily had changed. It was no longer the empty space between two strangers. It was the charged, heavy silence of a held breath. The Hawthorne Annual Winter Gala was held at the National Portrait Gallery. It was a night of aggressive opulence. The air smelled of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of old money. Men in tuxedos moved like sharks in a reef of black velvet, while women draped in silk laughed with practiced, musical precision. Emily stood near a marble pillar in the great hall, holding a tablet against her chest like a shield. She wasn't a guest. She was support staff. She wore a simple black dress that was elegant but intentionally forgettable, designed to blend into the background of the event she had helped orchestrate. Her job tonight was to manage the press exits and ensure that no unsanctioned questions reached Micah's clients. But her eyes weren't on the exits. They were on him. Micah stood in the center of the room, under the gaze of a dozen painted presidents. He was in his element, yet he looked utterly displaced. He held a flute of champagne he hadn't sipped in an hour. He nodded at a donor, smiled at a lobbyist, shook the hand of a rival. It was a performance of flawless, mechanical grace. To anyone else, he looked like a king. To Emily, who knew the cadence of his breathing and the specific tension in his jaw when he was overwhelmed, he looked like a man drowning in open air. He turned. Across the sea of shoulders and diamond earrings, his gaze locked onto hers. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a laser finding its target. The crowded room seemed to blur, the noise of a string quartet fading into a dull hum. For a terrifying second, Micah let the mask slip. The fatigue, the boredom, the longing, it was all there, broadcast on a frequency only she could tune into. He excused himself from the circle of admirers and began to move toward her. He didn't walk in a straight line. He wove through the crowd, strategic and deliberate, but his trajectory was undeniable. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. She considered retreating to the coat check, fading away as she was trained to do. But her feet refused to move. "You are hiding," Micah said as he reached her. He stood close enough that his shadow fell over her, creating a private alcove in the middle of the public spectacle. "I'm observing," Emily corrected, clutching the tablet tighter. "There is a difference. Hiding implies fear. Observing implies control. And which do you have tonight?" Micah asked, his voice low, vibrating through the small space between them. "Neither," she admitted softly. "I just see a room full of people pretending to be happy." Micah looked out at the crowd, his expression hardening. "They aren't pretending, Emily. They are content. They have power, and for them, that is the same thing as happiness. My mother taught me that before I could even walk. Power is the only currency that doesn't devalue." "And for you?" she dared to ask. Micah looked back at her. The blue of his eyes was darker tonight, shadowed by the dim gallery lighting. He looked at the simple neckline of her dress, at the stray wisp of hair near her ear, at the ink stain that was still faintly visible on her index finger, a badge of her labor in his world of leisure. "I think," Micah whispered, leaning in closer than propriety allowed, "that power is just the ability to choose your own cage. And I am beginning to resent the bars. We judge the depth of the ocean by the surface, forgetting that the real pressure crushes you only when you decide to dive." He reached out. For a moment, Emily thought he was going to touch her face. The air between them crackled with a static charge, so intense it made her dizzy. But his hand drifted past her cheek and landed on her shoulder, brushing a speck of non-existent dust from her black dress. It was a professional gesture on the surface, but the heat of his hand burned through the fabric. It was a claim. It was an excuse to touch her in a room where touching her was forbidden. "Your analysis of a senator was correct," Micah confessed, his hand lingering for a second too long before dropping. "The vulnerability worked. But it was dangerous, Emily. You opened a door I usually keep locked. And my mother, she doesn't like unlocked doors. Some doors need to be opened, Micah," she breathed, looking up at him. "Otherwise, the room runs out of oxygen." "Or the fire gets out," he countered. The tension was a physical weight now. They were standing on the precipice of something irreversible. Micah was looking at her not as an employee, not as a ghostwriter, but as the only real thing in a room of counterfeits. "Micah!" The name was spoken with the sharpness of a gavel. A woman appeared at Micah's elbow. She was tall, blonde, and radiating the icy perfection of the Hawthorne social circle. Vanessa's smile was a weapon, but her eyes were cold, scanning Emily with the calculated efficiency of a predator. "Your mother is looking for you, Micah," Vanessa said, her voice laced with a warning that Emily didn't fully understand yet. "She's in the VIP lounge with Senator Vance. She noticed you've been distracted this evening. She'd like a word about the strategy for next quarter." Micah flinched. The spell broke. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced instantly by the steel shutters of the consultant. He straightened his spine, stepping back from Emily, re-establishing the chasm of class and duty. He knew Vanessa wasn't just a guest. She was his mother's messenger, a reminder that he was being watched. "Of course, Vanessa," Micah said, his voice flat. Vanessa looked at Emily again, her gaze lingering on the tablet, categorizing her, dismissing her. "Is this your assistant?" Vanessa asked, bored. "Can she fetch us some water? The senator is parched. And your mother expects you to be prompt." Emily felt the sting of the humiliation like a slap. She waited for Micah to defend her. She waited for him to say, "She is my strategist." But Micah looked at Emily, and she saw the flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the senator. He was afraid of the woman waiting in the lounge. "She staff," Micah said coldly, refusing to meet Emily's eyes. "Emily, get the water." And then check the perimeter again. He turned his back on her. He offered his arm to Vanessa and walked away, leaving Emily standing alone by the marble pillar, holding her tablet, drowning in the middle of the gala, invisible once again. But as he walked away, Emily saw his hand clench into a fist at his side, tight enough to turn the knuckles white, a silent scream of a man who had just fired the only feeling he wanted to keep, under the shadow of his mother's empire. The week following the gala was a study in suffocation. The air in the Hawthorne consultancy did not move. It settled like dust in a sealed tomb. The elevators whispered, the phones purred, and the city outside turned a bruised shade of gray. But inside, the temperature had dropped to absolute zero. Emily did not go to the library. She worked from a small auxiliary desk in the archives, surrounded by boxes of shredded files. She was hiding, yes, but she told herself she was simply making it easier for him to ignore her. She had seen the look on his face when he walked away with Vanessa, the fear she had mistaken for coldness. She expected silence. She expected distance. She did not expect the summons. It came at 4 p.m. on a Friday. An email from his executive assistant. "Mr. Hawthorne requires your presence. Immediate." Emily smoothed her sweater. She checked her reflection in the darkened window of the archive room. She looked tired. She looked like staff. She walked the long corridor to the executive suite, her footsteps swallowed by the plush carpet, feeling like a prisoner walking to the scaffold. When she entered Micah's office, the blinds were drawn. The room was dim, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of his monitors. Micah was not sitting. He was standing by the shredder, feeding a document into its teeth. The sound was a violent, rhythmic tearing. He didn't turn around when the door clicked shut. "Sit down, Emily," he said. His voice was unrecognizable. It wasn't the smooth baritone of the gala, nor the rough whisper of the library. It was cold, metallic, and utterly detached. Emily sat. She folded her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking. "I've been reviewing the personnel files," Micah said, finally turning. He held a manila folder in his hand. He didn't look at her face. He looked at a point just above her head, staring at the blank wall. "Efficiency?" Emily asked, the word tasting strange. "I turned in the senator's follow-up remarks yesterday. The approval rating is up 3 points. The remarks were adequate," Micah dismissed, tossing the folder onto his desk. "But you have become a liability, Emily. My mother has been very clear about the standard of conduct required for our senior staff. Your presence here has become a distraction to the firm's mission. We are not poets, we are fixers." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She realized then that Vanessa had reported back. The touch on the shoulder at the gala, the conversation by the pillar. Eleanor Hawthorne had seen it all through the eyes of her messengers. "Your mother," Emily whispered, her voice rising. "This isn't about efficiency, Micah. This is about control. You told me the senator's speech was perfect. You told me, I told you it worked." Micah interrupted, his voice snapping like a dry twig. He slammed his hand down on the desk, the sound echoing off the glass walls. "But what works in the short term can destroy us in the long term. You are a variable I can no longer manage. I have arranged a transfer. Our London office needs a junior copy editor. The pay is substantial. The relocation is covered. You leave on Monday." It was a promotion on paper. It was an exile in reality. "You're sending me away," Emily said, her voice cracking. "Because you're afraid of her. Because I made you look real for 5 minutes, and you can't handle the consequences. I am sending you away because I don't want to see you anymore." Micah shouted. He caught himself on the edge of the cliff. He swallowed the truth, "I'm sending you away because she will destroy you if you stay near me," and replaced it with a lie that was designed to cut her so deep she would never look back. "I think about how unprofessional you are," Micah finished coldly. "You are just a ghostwriter. You took a job that required anonymity, and you try to make yourself the main character. It's pathetic, and I can't have it in my office. We hurt the ones we love not because we want them to bleed, but because we believe that pushing them away is the only way to save them from the wreckage of our own lives." Emily looked at him. She saw the tightness around his eyes. If she had been looking for strategy, she would have seen that he was lying. But Emily wasn't looking for strategy. She was looking for the man who had touched her shoulder at the gala. And that man was gone. "I am not a transcriber," Emily whispered, standing up. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I am the voice you wish you had. I am the heart you are too coward to show." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her security badge. She didn't put it on the desk. She dropped it on the floor. "I don't want London, and I don't want your money. If I'm a liability, Micah, then you are bankrupt. Because without the feelings you're trying to fire, you're just an empty suit in a glass tower." "Emily," he started, a crack appearing in his voice. "No," she said, stepping back toward the door. "You wanted efficiency. Here it is. I quit." She turned and walked out. She walked past the library, past the reception desk, and out of the double glass doors. Micah stood alone in his office. He looked at the security badge on the floor, a small square of plastic that held the photo of the only person who had ever truly seen him. He had successfully fired her. He had protected her from his mother's reach. He had won. So why did it feel like he had just signed his own death certificate? For days passed. 4 days where the Hawthorne consultancy operated with the seamless, terrifying efficiency of a machine that had excised a faulty part. The phones rang. The crises were managed. The senators were placated. But inside the executive suite, the machine was breaking down. Micah sat at his desk, staring at a blank screen. The cursor blinked, a rhythmic, mocking pulse. Blink, blink, blink. He was supposed to be writing a press release for a client involved in an embezzlement scandal. He knew the formula. He knew the buzzwords: accountability, transparency, moving forward. But every time he tried to type, he heard her voice. "Hollow is safe." He looked at the empty chair in the library through the glass wall. It was pushed in perfectly. The desk was clear. The ink stains were scrubbed away. It was as if Emily had never existed. And that was exactly what his mother, the formidable matriarch of the Hawthorne dynasty, had intended. Earlier that afternoon, Micah had overheard a call in the boardroom. His mother, speaking to a contact at a major publishing house in London, ensuring that that girl would be blacklisted if she didn't accept the transfer. They weren't just sending her away. They were preparing to erase her future to ensure she never sold her story. Micah felt a sickness rise in his throat that no amount of scotch could wash away. He hadn't saved her. He had simply handed her a blindfold before pushing her off the ledge. We tell ourselves we are the protectors of the people we love, when often we are just the jailers of their potential. He stood up. The chair scraped violently against the floor. He grabbed his coat. He didn't call his driver. He didn't check his schedule. For the first time in 10 years, Micah Hawthorne walked out of his tower without telling a soul where he was going. He drove his personal car, a vehicle that rarely left the garage, to a neighborhood he had only seen on maps. Adams Morgan. It was vibrant, messy, and alive, everything his world was not. He found her building. It was a pre-war walk-up with ivy clinging to the brick. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that felt like panic. He knocked. There was a long silence. Then, the sound of a lock turning. Emily opened the door. She wasn't wearing the charcoal sweater. She was wearing a paint-stained t-shirt and jeans. Her hair was down, wild and curling around her face. Behind her, the apartment was a chaos of cardboard boxes. She was packing, not for London, but for somewhere else, anywhere else. She looked at him, and her eyes went cold. "You have no jurisdiction here, Micah," she said, moving to close the door. Micah put his hand against the wood. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of desperation. "I didn't come to manage you, Emily," he said, his voice ragged. "I came to tell you the truth." "The truth?" Emily laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You told me the truth on Friday. I'm a liability. I'm unprofessional. I'm a distraction." "I lied," Micah breathed. Emily froze. She looked at his hand on the door, then up at his face. She saw the cracks in the marble. She saw the man who was drowning. "Let me in," he pleaded softly. "Please. I can't say this in the hallway." She hesitated, then stepped back, leaving the door open. Micah walked into her apartment. It was small, smelling of old books and vanilla candles. It was warm. It felt like a home, not a showroom. He saw her journal stacked on the floor, the words she wrote for herself, not for him. "My mother called the publishers in London today," Micah said, turning to face her. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. She wanted to ensure that if you refused the transfer, you wouldn't be hired anywhere else. "She sees you as a threat, Emily, not because you are unprofessional, but because you are the only one who knows where the bodies are buried." Emily stared at him, the color draining from her cheeks. She was going to blacklist me? She still might, Micah admitted. "That's why I fired you. I didn't send you away because you were a distraction. I sent you away because you were a target." He took a step closer, navigating the maze of boxes. "I thought if I cut you loose, if I made it look like I rejected you, she would lose interest. I thought I was saving you from the Hawthorne machine. I thought I was protecting you." "You weren't protecting me," Emily whispered, her voice shaking with a sudden, fierce anger. "You were making decisions for me. You treated me like a variable in one of your crisis management equations. You didn't ask me if I wanted to fight. You just decided I was too weak to survive." "No," Micah corrected, shaking his head. "I knew you were strong enough to fight. I was afraid that if you fought, I would have to choose a side, and I have never chosen anything but the firm." The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He had laid his cowardice on the table. He had admitted that his cruelty was born of fear, fear of losing his legacy, fear of defying his blood. "And now?" Emily asked, tears standing in her eyes. "Why are you here now?" "Because I sat at my desk for 4 days," Micah said, his voice breaking. "And I tried to write. I tried to think. But the silence, Emily, it wasn't the silence of power anymore. It was the silence of a grave." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, terrified to bridge the gap. "I can handle the scandal," Micah vowed. "I can handle the press. I can handle my mother burning down my inheritance. But I cannot handle the silence of a world where you don't exist. We spend our lives building fortresses to keep the pain out, only to realize that the walls we built are blocking the only light that could ever warm us." Emily looked at him. She saw the risk he was taking. By coming here, by admitting this, he was declaring war on his own family. He was choosing the liability over the asset. "You are going to lose everything, Micah," she warned him softly. "If you stand with me, they will strip you of the name. They will take the firm." "Let them take it," Micah whispered. "It's just glass and steel. It's hollow." He finally closed the distance. He took her hand, the hand stained with ink, the hand that had written the words that saved him. "I don't want to edit us any more," he said, looking into her eyes with a raw, terrifying hope. I want the unvarnished version, the messy version, the version where I don't have to pretend I'm not in love with the woman who writes my soul better than I live it. Emily looked at their joined hands. She felt the trembling in his fingers. She realized that he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for permission to fall. And for the first time, she didn't see a boss, or a Hawthorne, or a monument. She saw a man who had walked out of his tower to find the only person who knew his real name. "It's going to be a difficult draft," Emily whispered, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "I know," Micah replied, squeezing her hand, "but I hear I have the best writer in the city." He didn't kiss her yet. The moment was too fragile for that. Instead, he simply stood there in the clutter of her leaving, holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was rapidly dissolving around him. The apartment in Adams Morgan was quiet, but it was not the sterile, vacuum-sealed silence of the Hawthorne executive suite. It was a living silence, filled with the hum of the radiator, the distant wail of a siren, and the synchronized rhythm of two people breathing in a room that suddenly felt too small for the magnitude of what had just happened. Micah did not let go of Emily's hand. He held it as if it were the only tether keeping him from drifting into the stratosphere. He looked around the chaotic living room, the cardboard boxes, the stacked journals, the life she was packing up to escape him. "You don't have to go to London," Micah said, his voice rough with the aftershocks of his confession. "And you don't have to leave Washington. Unless you want to." "I was running away, Micah," Emily admitted, looking down at their interlaced fingers. "I thought if I put an ocean between us, I could stop hearing your voice in my head. I thought distance would cure the ghost." "And now?" he asked. "Now," Emily whispered, stepping closer. "The ghost is standing in my living room, and he looks terrified." Micah let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. He released her hand only to reach up and undo his tie, the silk noose of the Hawthorne legacy. He pulled it from his collar and dropped it onto a stack of books. Then he took off his watch, the heavy platinum timepiece that dictated his life in 15-minute intervals. He placed it on the table. "I am terrified," Micah confessed, stripping away the armor piece by piece. "I have spent 15 years managing crises for other people. I have spun lies into truths. I have cleaned up messes. But I have no idea how to manage my own life without a script." He walked over to the window, looking out at the streetlights reflecting on the damp pavement. "By tomorrow morning, the firm will be in chaos. My mother will unleash the legal team. The press will smell blood. I will be the headline. Emily, not the fixer." Emily walked up behind him. She didn't touch him yet. She simply stood in his space, offering her presence as a shield. "Let them talk," she said softly. "You've spent your whole life controlling the narrative, Micah. You've edited every feeling, every mistake, every vulnerability until there was nothing left but a polished surface. But people don't fall in love with surfaces." Micah turned from the window. The harsh streetlights cast shadows across his face, revealing the exhaustion he had hidden for so long. He looked at Emily, the woman in the paint-stained t-shirt who had seen through the glass tower from the very first day. "I tried to edit you out," Micah whispered, stepping into her, wrapping his arms around her waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "I tried to rewrite the draft where I didn't need you. But the words wouldn't stick." Emily held him. She felt the tension leaving his body, the rigid geometry of the consultant dissolving into the softness of a man who was finally allowed to be weak. "That's the thing about the truth, Micah," she murmured against his hair. "It doesn't need a ghostwriter. It just needs to be spoken." They stood there for a long time, swaying slightly in the dim light of the apartment. The war outside, the inevitable legal battles, the family disownment, the scandal, was waiting for the sun to rise. But in this moment, in the eye of the storm, there was peace. Micah pulled back slightly to look at her. His blue eyes, usually so cold and calculating, were warm and unguarded. "I don't have a plan," he said, and for the first time, the admission didn't sound like a failure. It sounded like a beginning. "I don't know what I'm going to do on Monday. I don't know who I am without the Hawthorne name." "You are the man who walked away from the Empire to apologize to the staff." Emily smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "That's a good opening chapter." Micah looked at her journals on the floor, then back at her. "Write it for me?" he asked, a playful, desperate edge to his voice. "No." Emily shook her head, her hand cupping his cheek. "This time, Micah, you have to write it yourself. I'm done being a ghost. I want to be the partner. We build empires on words, forgetting that silence is the only thing that cannot be edited. And it is in that silence, stripped of all rhetoric and defense, that love finally finds the courage to speak its name." Micah leaned in. The kiss was not like the one at the gala would have been, performative or stolen. It was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly real. It tasted of coffee and rain and the terrifying sweetness of freedom. It was a kiss that sealed the resignation letter he hadn't written yet, a kiss that burned the bridge to his past and lit the way to a messy, uncertain, and beautiful future. Narrator. The next morning, the sun rose over Washington, D.C., indifferent to the fall of dynasties. The phones at the Hawthorne consultancy rang unanswered in the executive suite. The press releases were drafted, the lawyers were summoned, and the machine began to grind its gears in fury. But across town, in a small apartment in Adams Morgan, Micah Hawthorne was asleep on a couch surrounded by boxes, one hand hanging off the edge, his fingers brushing against the floor. Emily sat in the window seat, watching the city wake up. She held a pen, but she wasn't writing a speech for a senator. She wasn't fixing a scandal. She was sketching the outline of a man who was finally breathing on his own. She looked at Micah, then at the empty street below. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. They would be stripped of the influence and the protection of a tower. But as she watched his chest rise and fall in the unedited rhythm of sleep, she realized that they had something the Hawthorne legacy could never buy. They had the truth. Micah stirred, opening his eyes to find her watching him. He didn't panic. He didn't check the time. He simply smiled, a small, crooked, genuine thing that had never appeared in any magazine profile. "Good morning," he whispered, his voice raspy with sleep. "Good morning," Emily replied, closing her notebook. He had tried to fire her feelings away, believing that a heart was just a liability on a balance sheet. But as the morning light flooded the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, Micah Hawthorne understood the final lesson. He spent a lifetime perfecting the art of the crisis, never suspecting that the only disaster worth surviving was the one that would finally force him to let her in.